wrestling match.
I want to face them in the eyes.
Take it. Put your finger on the trigger.
You're just a nerdy fellow that works on computers.
Gun to my wife's head. It's been decompressing the glass beneath you.
We invented half of our surveillance. Maybe y'all misjudged this individual.
Jump really fast, you might survive the blast.
Wait!
The Amateur, 2025, a complete analysis and explanation. The Amateur, 2025, is a contemporary spy thriller that fundamentally explores the transmutation of grief into cold, calculated violence, and this analysis will break down every narrative, thematic, and technical layer of the film. The Amateur, 2025, is not merely a remake of the 1981 film or a straightforward adaptation of Robert Little's novel. It is a complete recontextualization of the source material for a world dominated by digital surveillance, data brokers, and algorithmic warfare. The Amateur, 2025, begins with a thesis that the most dangerous weapon in the modern world is not a gun or a bomb, but a keyboard attached to a mind that has nothing left to lose. Charlie Heller is introduced as a man who represents the ultimate paradox within the intelligence community, a genius who is physically invisible. In these analyses and explanations, we must first understand that Charlie is not a field agent. He has never fired a weapon in anger, he has never engaged in hand-to-hand combat, and he actively avoids international travel. The narrative sets him up as a creature of the basement, a cryptographer who lives in a world of code, patterns, and theoretical problems, making his later transformation into a hunter of men all the more jarring and thematically rich. Rami Malek's physicality, or deliberate lack thereof, is used as a narrative tool. Malek, an actor known for playing characters with intense internal lives and minimal external expression, embodies a man who processes the world entirely through his intellect. The film does not try to turn him into an action hero. Instead, it weaponizes his awkwardness. When Charlie walks through the halls of the CIA, he is overlooked, and it is precisely this underestimation that becomes his greatest asset. The film's analyses reveal that his journey is not one of physical transformation, but of moral disintegration. The inciting incident in London is a sequence shot with a horrifying banality that strips away any Hollywood glamour from violence. Sarah Heller, played by Rachel Brosnahan, is not a spy. She is a civilian, an academic or professional attending a conference. Her death is presented as a random intersection of time and place, a tragic wrong place, wrong time scenario that shatters the ordered, predictable world Charlie has constructed for himself. The randomness is the point. It is not a targeted assassination, but collateral damage in a geopolitical game Charlie barely understands. Sarah's death functions as the emotional core from which all subsequent action radiates, yet the film makes an interesting structural choice in how it presents her character. She appears primarily in flashbacks, often bathed in warm, nostalgic light, wearing flowing fabrics that contrast sharply with the cold, blue-gray palette of Charlie's present reality. This stylistic decision creates a deliberate distance. We see Sarah not as she was, but as Charlie remembers her, idealized, softened, almost angelic. This visual language invites us to question whether Charlie is avenging a real woman or a memory he has already begun to mythologize. The CIA's refusal to act on Sarah's murder introduces the central institutional critique that runs throughout the narrative. Deputy Director Moore, played with a chilling bureaucratic calm by Holt McCallany, explains to Charlie that the attackers are foreign assets with intelligence value, and that geopolitical stability outweighs the life of one American civilian. This scene is crucial to understanding the film's moral universe. Moore is not a cartoon villain. He articulates the cold logic of statecraft, the utilitarian calculus that the agency performs every day. Charlie's refusal to accept this logic is what sets him on his path. Charlie's transformation from analyst to operative is catalyzed not by a training montage, but by an act of digital blackmail. Using his unparalleled skills as a decoder and hacker, he uncovers a dark secret buried in Moore's past. A secret substantial enough to destroy the deputy director's career and possibly send him to prison. This is the first demonstration of the film's central thesis. In the information age, secrets are currency, and Charlie is a billionaire. The blackmail sequence is tense not because of physical danger, but because of the quiet power shift it represents. Moore's response to the blackmail is a masterstroke of bureaucratic manipulation. He authorizes a training mission for Charlie, assigning him to Henderson, a veteran field operative played with world-weary gravitas by Laurence Fishburne. Henderson is told, implicitly, that Charlie is a loose end to be tied off. The mission is not designed to turn Charlie into a killer. It is designed to get him killed, preferably in a way that cannot be traced back to Langley. This dual-layered deception, Charlie blackmailing Moore trying to kill Charlie under the guise of training, creates a narrative tension that persists throughout the film. Laurence Fishburne's Henderson is perhaps the most fascinating character in the film because he occupies a moral gray zone that none of the other characters can access. Henderson has spent decades in the field, and his soul bears the scars of countless morally compromised operations. He initially views Charlie with contempt, a desk jockey playing at being a spy, but gradually develops a grudging respect for the younger man's ingenuity. Fishburne brings a Shakespearean weight to the role, delivering monologues about the cost of violence that serve as the film's philosophical anchor. The training sequences between Henderson and Charlie subvert every expectation established by the spy thriller genre. Henderson tries to teach Charlie hand-to-hand combat, and Charlie fails, repeatedly and embarrassingly. Henderson tries to teach him firearms, and Charlie's shots go wide. The message is clear. Charlie will never win a physical confrontation. Henderson's frustration is palpable, but it blinds him to what Charlie is actually doing, observing, cataloging, learning the patterns and weaknesses of the system itself. What Henderson eventually realizes is that he is not training a soldier. He is unleashing a systems analyst on the physical world. Charlie begins to see violence not as a physical act, but as a problem to be solved, a series of variables to be manipulated. He starts asking questions that Henderson cannot answer. Not, how do I kill this man? But, what are the structural weaknesses of the building he works in? What are the failure points of his daily routine? Where does the system fail to protect him? This intellectual approach to killing is what sets the film apart from its peers. The European phase of the film transforms the narrative into a procedural thriller with a distinctly cold, almost clinical atmosphere. Charlie travels across London, Paris, Marseille, and Istanbul, each city rendered not as a tourist destination, but as a labyrinth of surveillance cameras, data networks, and vulnerable infrastructure. The cinematography emphasizes this, framing Charlie against the impersonal geometry of modern urban architecture, a small figure moving through vast, indifferent systems. The introduction of Inquiline, played by Katrina Balfe, provides the emotional counterweight that the film desperately needs. Inquiline is a Russian widow, an informant who has lost her own husband to the same violent machinery that took Sarah. Balfe's performance is luminous and wounded, her character carrying a grief that mirrors Charlie's but expresses itself differently. Where Charlie retreats into cold logic, Inquiline has learned to survive by forming careful, conditional human connections. Their relationship is not a romance but a recognition, two ghosts acknowledging each other across the void. Inquiline functions as an audience surrogate in many ways, asking the questions that we want to ask Charlie. Why are you doing this? What will it cost you? What will be left of you when it is over? Her presence also complicates the film's gender politics, which could have been disastrous given the fridged wife premise. Inquiline is not a replacement for Sarah. She is a witness to Charlie's transformation, and her own history of loss gives her the moral authority to judge him. The revenge killings themselves are constructed as elaborate logic puzzles rather than action set pieces. Charlie's first target is located in a Paris apartment building, and the sequence unfolds with the precision of a mathematical proof. Charlie does not enter the building with a weapon. He enters with knowledge. He has studied the building's schematics, identified the gas lines, calculated the timing of the target's routines. The death, when it comes, is presented not as a triumph but as an inevitability, the final line in a chain of deductions. This MacGyver-style approach to violence is both the film's greatest innovation and, for some viewers, its greatest weakness. Charlie's traps and schemes require a level of omniscience that strains credibility. He destabilizes a balcony railing knowing exactly when his target will lean against it. He triggers a chain reaction in a warehouse that unfolds with Rube Goldberg precision. The film asks us to believe that Charlie's intellect is so powerful that the physical world becomes as predictable as a line of code, and whether you accept this premise determines how much you enjoy the film. The surveillance technology depicted in the film exists at the bleeding edge of what is currently possible, and the production employed technical advisors to ground the hacking sequences in reality, though they admitted to giving everything a Hollywood boost. Charlie's ability to access CCTV networks, spoof facial recognition systems, and track targets through their digital exhaust feels unsettlingly plausible in an era of ubiquitous data collection. The film makes a compelling argument that the infrastructure of the surveillance state is a weapon waiting to be picked up by anyone smart enough to wield it. John Bernthal's character, a cold-eyed operative dispatched to eliminate Charlie, represents a significant point of contention among critics and audiences. Bernthal is an actor of immense intensity, capable of conveying volcanic rage beneath a deceptively calm surface, but the script gives him almost nothing to do. He appears in perhaps 2 or 3 scenes, his motivations remain opaque, and his eventual confrontation with Charlie is resolved so quickly that it feels like an afterthought. The waste of Bernthal's talents is one of the film's most commonly cited flaws. Michael Stuhlbarg suffers a similar fate in an even smaller role, appearing briefly as a CIA analyst or bureaucrat whose function in the plot is purely expository. When a film of this caliber casts actors of this quality and then gives them essentially walk-on roles, it suggests either a script that was heavily cut in post-production or a fundamental misjudgment about how to allocate screen time. The supporting cast is a reservoir of talent that the film never fully taps. The dual chase structure of the narrative, Charlie hunting the terrorists while the CIA hunts Charlie, creates a recursive loop of pursuers and pursued that mirrors the film's thematic concern with systems. Charlie is both predator and prey, and the categories blur as the story progresses. The terrorists he is hunting are themselves cogs in a larger machine, men who killed Sarah not out of personal malice, but because they were following orders. This diffusion of moral responsibility is one of the film's most unsettling arguments. The film's pacing has been a significant point of discussion in critical reception. The first 45 minutes are deliberately slow, establishing Charlie's world and the mechanics of his grief before the narrative kicks into gear. Some viewers find this opening act ponderous, arguing that it mistakes stillness for depth. Others defend it as necessary groundwork, a calm before the storm that makes the subsequent violence more impactful. The middle act, covering Charlie's European odyssey, is generally considered the film's strongest section, a gripping procedural that generates tension through intellect rather than action. The ending of the film is likely to be its most divisive element, and these analyses and explanations must grapple with its implications carefully. Charlie succeeds in eliminating all 4 terrorists responsible for Sarah's death, but the final kill brings him no catharsis. The last target is a man who is, like Charlie, just a cog in a machine, a functionary who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, carrying out orders he did not fully understand. When Charlie confronts him, the man's terror and confusion force Charlie, and the audience, to confront the possibility that revenge has no moral endpoint. The absence of catharsis is the point. Charlie has spent the entire film believing that if he could just kill the men who took Sarah from him, the hole in his life would close. But when the last body falls, the hole remains. Sarah is still dead. Charlie is still alone. The violence has changed nothing except Charlie himself, who now carries the weight of multiple killings on a conscience that was once defined by its innocence. The film argues that revenge is not a solution but a symptom, a manifestation of grief that cannot actually heal the wound it addresses. The final confrontation with the CIA unfolds not as a firefight, but as a negotiation. Charlie, anticipating that the agency will never let him walk away, has prepared a failsafe. The evidence he uncovered to blackmail Moore, along with documentation of the CIA's broader malfeasance, is packaged and ready to be released to journalists, foreign governments, and the public. He does not threaten to kill the officials who confront him. He threatens to expose them, to destroy their system from within using its own secrets. Moore and his allies recognize that Charlie has checkmated them. They cannot kill him without triggering the release of the information. They cannot let him go without risking that he will release it anyway. The standoff resolves in a grim compromise. Charlie is absorbed back into the agency, his skills too valuable to waste and his knowledge too dangerous to set free. He does not go to prison, but he does not go home either. He becomes a tool of the very system that he set out to punish. This ending has been interpreted by some as a victory for Charlie. He survives, after all, but a closer reading suggests something far darker. Charlie began his journey as an amateur, a man acting outside the system to achieve justice. By the end, he has been fully professionalized. He has learned to kill, to manipulate, to blackmail, and the system has recognized him as one of its own. He has won his revenge, but he has lost his soul. The cage door has closed behind him, and he may not even realize he is inside it. The film's final shot reportedly lingers on Charlie's face, and Malek's expression is unreadable. Is it satisfaction? Resignation? Despair? The ambiguity is intentional. The system has absorbed another operator, and the cycle continues. This is a sobering conclusion for a mainstream thriller, a refusal to provide the emotional release that audiences have been conditioned to expect. Critics have described it as a reflection on the steep cost of pursuing justice within a system built on lies, and that framing captures the film's essential pessimism. The thematic architecture of the film is built around the tension between human emotion and systemic logic. Charlie's grief is a profoundly human experience, messy and irrational and consuming. The CIA's response to Sarah's death is a profoundly systemic one, cold and calculating and efficient. The entire narrative charts Charlie's journey from the human realm into the systemic, from a man who feels too much to a man who has learned to feel nothing at all. The tragedy is not that Charlie loses his fight, but that he wins it. The surveillance state functions in the film as both antagonist and tool, a dual role that reflects our own ambivalent relationship with technology. Charlie uses the same facial recognition software, the same data aggregation tools, the same algorithmic analysis that the CIA uses to track him. He turns the master's tools against the master's house, to borrow Audre Lorde's formulation. But the film suggests that wielding those tools transforms the wielder. You cannot weaponize the surveillance state without becoming complicit in its logic. Director James Hawes brought to the project a sensibility honed on the acclaimed series Slow Horses, another story about the unglamorous fringes of the intelligence world. Hawes understands that spy craft is often tedious, that operatives spend more time waiting and watching than acting, and that the moral compromises of the profession accumulate quietly over time. His direction emphasizes these qualities, creating a film that feels grounded and procedural even when the plotting stretches credibility. The visual language of the film deserves close analysis. Hawes and his cinematographer employ a color palette that shifts subtly as Charlie descends deeper into his mission. The early scenes in Virginia are warm and golden, saturated with the light of domestic happiness. The London sequences introduce grays and blues, a desaturation that mirrors Charlie's emotional numbing. By the time the narrative reaches Istanbul, the color has drained almost entirely, and Charlie moves through a world that looks like it has already been bleached of life. The The score, composed with an emphasis on electronic textures and processed sounds, reinforces the film's thematic concern with the intersection of humanity and technology. Organic instruments are sampled, manipulated, and layered with synthetic elements until the source becomes ambiguous. Is that a human voice or a digital approximation? A real string section or a virtual instrument? The music refuses to answer, just as the film refuses to cleanly separate Charlie's humanity from the technological systems he now inhabits. Rachel Brosnahan's limited screen time has been a focal point of criticism, with some arguing that Sarah is underwritten to the point of being a plot device rather than a character. This is a valid critique, and it points to a larger challenge the film faces. The narrative requires Sarah to be a motivating absence, a ghost that haunts Charlie's every action, but the audience needs to feel that absence as a real loss. If Sarah remains an abstraction, Charlie's grief remains abstract, and the emotional stakes of his revenge become theoretical rather than visceral. The chemistry between Malek and Brosnahan, in the brief scenes they share, suggests a warmth and intimacy that the script does not fully explore. There is a version of this film that spends more time establishing Sarah as a fully realized human being, giving the audience a reason to mourn her beyond the fact that Charlie does. The decision to minimize her presence was likely a structural choice. Keep the focus on Charlie's solo journey, but it comes at a significant emotional cost. The film's engagement with the amateur concept is more sophisticated than it first appears. Charlie is an amateur only in the sense that he lacks formal training. In every other respect, his approach to violence is hyper-professional, drawing on a lifetime of analytical discipline. The title becomes ironic. The amateur is more effective than the professionals because he is not constrained by their assumptions, their protocols, their institutional inertia. He sees solutions that they cannot see because he does not know what is supposed to be impossible. This inversion of expertise is one of the film's most resonant ideas. The CIA is depicted as an organization that has become so large, so procedural, so risk-averse that it can no longer accomplish the basic functions for which it was created. Charlie, operating alone with no resources beyond his own intelligence, outmaneuvers the entire agency. The film suggests that institutions inevitably become self-serving, prioritizing their own survival over their stated missions, and that real change can only come from individuals willing to operate outside the system. The terrorists themselves are deliberately underdeveloped as characters, a choice that has frustrated some viewers, but that serves a thematic purpose. By refusing to give the killers compelling motivations or sympathetic backstories, the film denies Charlie, and the audience, the satisfaction of understanding them. They remain opaque, interchangeable, just as Sarah remained opaque and interchangeable to them. The violence is not a clash of ideologies or personalities. It is a collision of systems, impersonal and mechanical. The European locations serve as more than scenic backdrops. Each city represents a different facet of the surveillance infrastructure that the film examines. London, with its dense network of public CCTV cameras, is the panopticon made literal. Paris offers a contrast, its romantic surface concealing a deep entanglement with intelligence agencies and their dark histories. Istanbul, straddling two continents, embodies the liminal space between East and West, the blurred boundaries that spycraft exploits. The film uses these locations to suggest that surveillance is not an American phenomenon, but a global one, a web that connects every modern city. Katrina Balfe's Inquiline delivers what may be the film's most important speech, a monologue about the difference between justice and revenge that serves as the moral center of the narrative. She tells Charlie, from hard-won experience, that revenge is a hunger that grows the more you feed it, that the satisfaction he seeks will recede the closer he gets to it. Her words function as prophecy, and Charlie's inability to hear them, his insistence on continuing his mission despite her warning, is the film's clearest indication that he is not on a path toward healing. The relationship between Charlie and Henderson evolves in ways that neither character anticipates. Henderson begins as a cynical handler, expecting Charlie to die and prepared to facilitate that outcome. But Charlie's ingenuity surprises him, and the old operative finds himself in the uncomfortable position of respecting a man he was supposed to betray. Their dynamic becomes almost paternal, with Henderson offering hard-won wisdom that Charlie is too consumed by grief to fully absorb. Fishburne and Malek play these scenes with a restraint that honors the complexity of the relationship. The film's treatment of violence is deliberately unspectacular. Deaths are quick, messy, and often awkward, lacking the balletic grace of a John Wick or the brutal efficiency of a Jason Bourne. Charlie's kills are improvised and sometimes go wrong, requiring adjustment and improvisation. This commitment to depicting violence as a difficult, unpleasant, and morally corrosive act is one of the film's strengths, even if it makes for less crowd-pleasing entertainment than audiences might expect from a revenge thriller. The digital traps that Charlie employs, the sabotaged infrastructure, the manipulated surveillance feeds, the algorithmic predictions of his target's movements, raise interesting questions about the nature of agency in the modern world. If Charlie can predict exactly where his target will be at a given moment because algorithms have rendered human behavior predictable, what does that say about free will? The film flirts with a kind of technological determinism, a vision of the world in which human choices are just variables in an equation that a sufficiently powerful intelligence can solve. The screenplay, by Ken Nolan and Gary Spinelli, struggles at times to balance the film's competing impulses. Nolan's experience on Black Hawk Down suggests a facility with military procedure and ensemble action. Spinelli's work on American Made indicates an interest in the amorality of American covert operations. Their collaboration produces moments of sharp insight into the intelligence world, but the script sometimes feels torn between being a taut procedural and a character study, delivering neither with full commitment. The pacing issues that critics have identified can be traced to this structural tension. The first act is essentially a drama about grief, the second act a spy procedural, and the third act a philosophical meditation on the cost of revenge. Each section works on its own terms, but the transitions between them are not always smooth. The film asks audiences to shift emotional registers multiple times, and some viewers will find the gear changes jarring. Rami Malek's performance as Charlie Heller is a Rorschach test for audiences, dividing viewers along lines that reveal more about their expectations than about his work. For those who see an emotionally stunted, robotic portrayal, Malek's characteristic intensity registers as flatness, a failure to convey the rage and sorrow that the role demands. For those who see a man in the grip of dissociative grief, Malek's stillness is the point, a depiction of someone who has retreated so far into his own mind that his body has become a shell. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. What cannot be denied is that Malek commits fully to the conception of Charlie as a man out of his element. His physical awkwardness in the action sequences is not an actor's limitation, but a character choice. When Charlie runs, he runs like someone who has never had to run before. When he handles a weapon, his grip is tentative, his stance wrong. These details ground the film in a reality that more polished action thrillers often sacrifice for spectacle. The director of photography employs shallow depth of field to isolate Charlie from his environment, particularly in the film's second half. As Charlie's mission intensifies, the backgrounds blur, and he becomes a sharp figure against an indistinct world. This visual strategy externalizes his psychological state. He is so focused on his targets that everything else has become peripheral, including his own humanity. The technique is effective but risks becoming monotonous, a one-note representation of a complex internal process. The sound design is similarly attuned to Charlie's subjectivity. The ambient noise of the world, traffic, conversation, the hum of machinery, fades in and out depending on his level of focus. In moments of intense concentration, the soundscape reduces to a low-frequency drone, the auditory equivalent of tunnel vision. When violence erupts, it does so with a jarring loudness that startles the audience out of the meditative calm, a sonic representation of the intrusion of the real into Charlie's carefully constructed mental space. The film's engagement with the 1981 source material and its previous adaptation is worth examining. The Cold War context of the original has been replaced by the diffuse, non-state threats of the modern era, but the fundamental question, what happens when a man trained to analyze threats decides to become one, remains the same. The 2025 version updates the technology and the geopolitics, but the moral inquiry is timeless, and the new film honors the spirit of Little's novel even as it alters the details. Where the 2025 film distinguishes itself most sharply from its predecessor is in its pessimism. The 1981 film, shaped by the moral clarity of the Cold War, offered a more straightforward critique of the intelligence community's cynicism. The new film, made in an era of institutional collapse and epistemological crisis, offers no such clarity. There are no good institutions and no easy answers, only compromised individuals making impossible choices in a system that will ultimately consume them all. The supporting performance by Holt McCallany as Deputy Director deserves more attention than it has received. McCallany, a character actor with a long history of playing menacing authority figures, brings a bureaucratic smoothness to Moore that is more chilling than outright villainy would be. Moore does not hate Charlie. He sees him as a problem to be managed, a variable to be controlled. His decisions are not personal, and that impersonality is precisely what makes him monstrous. The scene in which Charlie confronts Moore with the evidence of his past misdeeds is one of the film's best, a duel of intellects conducted entirely through subtext and implication. Neither man raises his voice. Neither threatens the other explicitly. The power shift happens in the space between words, in the tiny micro-expressions that flicker across McCallany's face as he realizes that the desk jockey he has always dismissed has just outmaneuvered him completely. The film's title, beyond its literal reference to Charlie's lack of field training, carries multiple layers of meaning. An amateur is someone who does something for love rather than money. The word derives from the Latin amare, to love. Charlie's mission is, in this sense, profoundly amateurish. He is not a mercenary seeking payment or an operative following orders. He is a husband acting out of love for his murdered wife. The tragedy is that the purity of this motivation does not protect him from the corrupting nature of the acts he commits. The love that drives Charlie is the film's great unexamined variable. We are told that he loved Sarah, and Malek's performance communicates a depth of feeling that the script does not always support. But the film never fully interrogates what that love means, or whether it can survive being transformed into a motive for murder. If love leads to killing, is it still love? Or has it become something else, something that wears love's face but has possession or obsession at its core? These are the questions that the film gestures toward but does not fully explore, and they represent its most significant missed opportunity. A version of this story that spent more time in the space between love and violence, that forced Charlie to confront the possibility that Sarah would not have wanted this, that examined the selfishness inherent in making another person's death about your own need for closure. That version would be a masterpiece. The version we have is content to raise the questions without answering them. The international cast and locations give the film a cosmopolitan texture that distinguishes it from more insular American spy thrillers. The presence of European actors in significant roles, the multilingual dialogue, the attention to the specific textures of each city, all of these elements suggest a world that is genuinely global, a network of interconnected spaces in which national boundaries are increasingly irrelevant. The surveillance state, the film reminds us, is not an American invention. It is a global infrastructure. The editing rhythm of the film shifts markedly between its acts. The first act uses longer takes and more patient cutting, allowing scenes to breathe and silences to accumulate. The second act accelerates, with quicker cuts that mirror the pace of Charlie's mission. The third act finds a middle ground, a kind of exhausted stillness that reflects Charlie's depleted state. This editorial architecture is effective at a craft level, but it contributes to the sense that the film is three different movies stitched together. The color grading in the flashback sequences employs a noticeably different palette than the main narrative, leaning into warm ambers and soft golds that evoke a nostalgic, irretrievable past. These scenes have the quality of old photographs, images of a happiness that has already faded. The effect is beautiful but also distancing, reinforcing the idea that Sarah exists in the film primarily as an object of memory rather than as a living presence. The film's commercial reception has been shaped by the mismatch between its marketing and its content. Trailers presented it as a propulsive action thriller in the Taken mold, but the actual film is slower, more contemplative, and less satisfying as a straightforward revenge narrative. Audiences who came expecting cathartic violence and a triumphant ending were disappointed. Audiences who came with no expectations found something stranger and more interesting. The marketing campaign may have done the film a disservice. The streaming-era context of the film's release is relevant to understanding its reception. In an earlier era, The Amateur would have been a mid-budget adult thriller, the kind of film that could find an audience through word of mouth and a long theatrical run. In 2025, it exists in a landscape where such films are increasingly rare, and the metrics of success have shifted. Its decent streaming watch reputation reflects not just its quality, but the changed expectations of an audience that consumes most of its content at home. The philosophical underpinnings of the film owe a debt to the tradition of paranoid thrillers that flourished in the 1970s. Films like The Conversation, The Parallax View, and 3 Days of the Condor explored similar territory. The individual crushed by systems, the impossibility of trust, the erosion of identity in the face of institutional power. The Amateur updates these concerns for the digital age, replacing the analog paranoia of wiretaps and microfilm with the digital paranoia of data mining and algorithmic surveillance. The difference between the 1970s paranoid thrillers and this film is instructive. In the earlier films, the protagonist typically uncovers a conspiracy and is destroyed or neutralized by it. The system wins, but the audience is left with a sense of outrage. In The Amateur, Charlie does not uncover a conspiracy so much as he joins one. He becomes part of the system he initially opposed, and the film does not encourage outrage so much as a grim, fatalistic acceptance. This is a 21st century ending for a 21st century story. The representation of hacking and digital warfare in the film is more grounded than most Hollywood depictions, thanks to the involvement of technical consultants. The film shows Charlie using social engineering, phishing attacks, and exploitation of known software vulnerabilities, rather than the magical breaking through firewalls sequences that plague lesser films. This attention to detail lends credibility to Charlie's capabilities and makes the threat he represents feel plausible. The film's treatment of women is a complex issue that merits careful analysis. Sarah is fridged, killed to motivate the male protagonist's journey, and this is a trope with a long and problematic history in fiction. Inquiline complicates the picture somewhat, emerging as a fully realized character with her own agency and moral compass. But she too exists primarily in relation to Charlie's journey. The film does not entirely escape the gravitational pull of its genre's gender conventions. Rachel Brosnahan's casting is itself an interesting choice, given her association with the fast-talking, fiercely independent title character of the marvelous Mrs. Maisel. Seeing her in such a constrained, ultimately victimized role creates a cognitive dissonance that the film does not address. Her presence gestures toward a version of Sarah that the script never allows to exist, a woman with a rich inner life and a sharp wit, reduced on screen to a loving wife and a tragic memory. The film's most unsettling implication is that Charlie was always capable of this transformation, that the capacity for cold, calculating violence was latent within him, waiting for a sufficiently powerful trigger. The quiet, introverted cryptographer and the ruthless, methodical killer are not opposites but potential states of the same person. The distance between them is not a journey of becoming but a stripping away, a removal of the inhibitions and moral constraints that had previously kept the capacity dormant. This reading casts Charlie's intellectualism in a new light. His preference for systems over people, his comfort with abstraction, his ability to reduce complex phenomena to analyzable patterns. These are not just personality traits, but the prerequisites for the kind of violence he eventually commits. The film suggests, perhaps unintentionally, that the skills that make a brilliant analyst are not so different from the skills that make a remorseless killer. Both require a certain distance from the human reality of their objects of study. The film's legacy will likely be as a curious artifact of its moment, a spy thriller that tried to do something different with genre conventions and succeeded only partially. It is too slow for action audiences, too shallow for art house audiences, and too ambiguous for mainstream audiences. But for those who find their way to it with adjusted expectations, it offers a distinctive experience. A revenge film that questions the value of revenge, a spy film that finds suspense in logic rather than action, and a character study about a man who loses himself in the systems he set out to defeat. The closing moments of the film, in which Charlie is absorbed back into the agency, leave the audience with a question that the film refuses to answer. Was it worth it? Sarah is still dead. The terrorists are dead, but the system that created them continues. Charlie has traded his soul for a revenge that brought him no peace, and now he serves the very institution he once blackmailed. The film offers no redemption, no closure, and no comfort. It simply ends, leaving the audience to sit with the weight of what they have witnessed. In the final analysis, this is a film about the architecture of grief in a world that has no room for it. Charlie's tragedy is not that his wife died, though that is tragic, but that he lived in a system that had no way to honor his loss, that treated her death as a line item in a geopolitical ledger. His turn to violence is a response to a world that has forgotten how to mourn, that processes all human experience through the cold logic of utility. The film is, at its core, an argument for the necessity of grief, a warning about what happens when we refuse to make space for the messy, inconvenient, profoundly human work of mourning. The casting of Rami Malek as a leading man in a spy thriller represents a deliberate subversion of Hollywood's traditional physical archetypes, a decision that carries significant cultural weight and reframes audience expectations about who gets to occupy the center of these narratives. Malek's slender frame and distinctive features stand in stark contrast to the chiseled physiques of his genre predecessors, and the film leverages this difference to construct a protagonist whose power resides entirely in his neurological architecture rather than his musculature. The actor's background in playing Elliot Alderson on Mr. Robot creates an intertextual resonance that the film exploits intelligently, inviting viewers to see Charlie Heller as a spiritual cousin to that earlier character while allowing the performance to carve its own distinct emotional territory. Malek's characteristic stillness, often criticized as wooden or one-note, functions here as a sophisticated representation of a mind processing grief through the only channel it knows: analysis, computation, the relentless reduction of emotional chaos into manageable data points. The actor makes the bold choice to underplay moments that other performers would have milked for cathartic release, and this restraint forces the audience to lean in, to search his impassive face for the micro-expressions that betray the volcanic emotion churning beneath the surface. His eye movements alone convey a startling amount of information, darting across environments as if scanning for threats, cataloging exits, calculating trajectories, and this constant visual processing becomes the film's primary action vocabulary. The performance is a masterclass in internalization, a portrait of a man who has so thoroughly sublimated his feelings into intellectual activity that the two have become indistinguishable, and this psychological fusion is the engine that drives the entire narrative forward. Malek understands that Charlie is not a hero in any traditional sense, not even an antihero in the charismatic mold that audiences have been conditioned to embrace, but rather a cautionary figure whose transformation from victim to perpetrator should unsettle rather than inspire. The performance refuses to offer the audience an easy point of identification, maintaining a slight but persistent distance that mirrors Charlie's own estrangement from his former self. In the quiet moments between set pieces, Malek does his most impressive work, conveying through posture and breath the gradual calcification of a human soul, the slow death of the man who existed before Sarah's murder. The physical awkwardness that Malek brings to the action sequences is carefully calibrated to be just convincing enough to sell the threat while remaining authentically clumsy, a tightrope walk that prevents the film from tipping into either absurdity or conventional heroism. His scenes with Laurence Fishburne reveal a generational contrast in acting styles that enriches both performances, with Fishburne's theatrical gravity providing a counterweight to Malek's minimalist intensity. The Oscar-winning actor has never been more vulnerable on screen, and this vulnerability is precisely what makes Charlie's eventual transformation so disturbing, because we have been granted intimate access to the gentleness that violence systematically extinguishes. Malek's chemistry with Katrina Balfe produces the film's most emotionally legible sequences, as two performers skilled at conveying damage through restraint find a common language that transcends the script's occasional limitations. The performance ultimately asks more of its audience than most revenge thrillers dare to request, demanding that we sit with discomfort rather than offering the release of vicarious triumph. The geopolitical context of the film's narrative engages with a post-unipolar world order in which the clear moral frameworks of the Cold War have dissolved into a murky landscape of non-state actors, privatized intelligence, and deniable operations that blur the boundaries between ally and adversary. The terrorist cell that murders Sarah exists within this ambiguous space, neither fully independent nor entirely the proxy of any single state, and this diffusion of responsibility is central to the film's critique of contemporary violence. The CIA's decision to protect the attackers rather than pursue justice reflects a geopolitical calculus in which every actor is potentially useful, every relationship transactional, and every moral principle negotiable when weighed against strategic advantage. This depiction of the intelligence community as fundamentally amoral rather than immoral distinguishes the film from more simplistic conspiracy narratives, acknowledging that the people who make these decisions are not cackling villains, but bureaucrats navigating a system whose incentives have become decoupled from any coherent ethical framework. The film subtly maps the geography of modern terrorism onto the infrastructure of global capital, tracing the movement of money, information, and personnel through the same channels that facilitate legitimate commerce. Charlie's journey across European capitals becomes an education in the porosity of borders, the ease with which determined actors can exploit the gaps between jurisdictions, and the structural advantages that accrue to those who operate outside the law. The film's Istanbul sequence is particularly rich with geopolitical implication, positioning the city as a liminal zone where European and Middle Eastern networks intersect, where identities are fluid, and where the certainties that structure Western intelligence operations begin to unravel. The presence of Russian characters, including Inquiline, gestures toward the enduring relevance of great power competition, even as the narrative's primary antagonists operate in the gray zones between state interests. The film avoids the lazy Orientalism that mars many Western spy thrillers, presenting its international settings with a specificity that honors local texture while maintaining the narrative's paranoid atmosphere. The terrorists are not exoticized or dehumanized in ways that would let the audience off the hook. They are presented as men with ordinary faces, ordinary routines, and ordinary justifications for the extraordinary violence they commit. This refusal to otherize the antagonists is one of the film's most politically sophisticated choices, because it forces the uncomfortable recognition that monstrosity is not an inherent property of certain kinds of people, but a potential that exists within systems that dehumanize their targets. The film's geopolitical vision is ultimately a bleak one, suggesting that the architecture of international relations has become a machine for producing violence, and that individuals who enter that machine, whether as operatives or as civilians, are ground down by forces they can neither control nor fully comprehend. The intelligence that Charlie gathers throughout his mission paints a picture of a world in which no one is truly in charge, where chains of command dissolve into networks of mutual convenience, and where accountability is perpetually deferred into the fog of plausible deniability. This systemic critique elevates the film above its genre constraints, transforming a revenge narrative into a meditation on the impossibility of justice in a world without stable moral reference points. The sound design and auditory architecture of the film constitute a parallel narrative that deserves extensive analysis, operating beneath conscious perception to shape emotional responses and reinforce thematic content. The sonic environment of Charlie's world is constructed with extraordinary precision, establishing a baseline of ambient noise, server fans, fluorescent hum, distant traffic, that defines the acoustic territory of his pre-trauma existence. When Sarah dies, the soundscape fractures, and the film introduces a recurring motif of high-frequency, ringing that seems to emanate from within Charlie's own consciousness, a tinnitus of grief that persists throughout his mission. The score, composed primarily of processed electronic sounds and manipulated instrumental samples, blurs the boundary between diegetic and non-diegetic audio in ways that mirror Charlie's dissolving grip on the distinction between his internal calculations and external reality. In moments of intense focus, the ambient noise drops away entirely, replaced by a low-frequency drone that creates a sense of isolation, so profound it becomes almost physical, as if the audience has been sealed inside Charlie's skull alongside him. The sound of keyboard clicks becomes a percussion section, rhythmic and relentless, transforming the act of hacking into something that registers in the body as tension and release. Gunshots, when they occur, are startlingly loud and untreated, stripped of the cinematic compression that typically makes movie violence palatable, and this rawness contributes to the film's commitment to depicting violence as genuinely unpleasant. The dialogue mixing prioritizes clarity over naturalism, with conversations captured with an intimacy that feels almost invasive, as if the audience is eavesdropping on exchanges that should remain private. The film's use of silence is equally strategic, with long stretches in which the absence of sound creates a vacuum that the audience's own anxiety rushes to fill. Inquiline's scenes are accompanied by a warmer sonic palette, strings that recall Russian classical music and suggest a depth of cultural memory that contrasts with the sterile digital soundscapes that surround Charlie. The sound of Charlie's breathing becomes a subtle but persistent presence, accelerating in moments of danger, catching in moments of emotional stress, and this physiological audio cue connects the audience to his body even as his mind seems to detach from it. The final act introduces a new sonic element, the low, almost subsonic rumble of institutional machinery, the sound of the system reabsorbing its rogue element, and this acoustic shift signals the narrative's turn toward its grim conclusion. The credit sequence is accompanied by a piece that combines all the film's sonic motifs into a single composition, a summary of the auditory journey that lingers in the audience's ears as they process what they have witnessed. The sound design team has created a work of art that functions independently of the image, a radio play embedded within a visual narrative, and audiences who attend to it closely will discover a layer of meaning that enriches every other aspect of the film. The philosophical dimensions of the narrative engage with ancient questions about justice, revenge, and the possibility of meaningful action within deterministic systems. And the film earns its place in the long tradition of works that treat the revenge narrative as a vehicle for ethical inquiry. The distinction between justice and revenge, which the film repeatedly interrogates without ever resolving, traces its lineage back through Aeschylus and the Orestia, in which the transformation from blood feud to legal process represents the founding moment of civilization itself. Charlie's journey inverts this progression, beginning within a system that purports to offer justice through institutional processes and ending in a pre-legal state of personal vengeance that the film refuses to glamorize. The question that haunts every frame is whether Charlie's actions can be distinguished from the violence that took Sarah from him, and the film's answer, that they cannot, positions it firmly within a tragic tradition that denies its protagonist the satisfaction of righteous anger. The surveillance technology that enables Charlie's mission raises philosophical questions about free will and determinism that the film explores with surprising sophistication, suggesting that a world in which human behavior can be predicted algorithmically is a world in which moral responsibility begins to evaporate. If Charlie can calculate exactly where his target will be at a given moment, to what extent is that target exercising genuine agency? And to what extent is he simply a variable in an equation that Charlie is solving? The film draws on the tradition of existentialist thought, particularly the work of thinkers who have wrestled with the problem of authenticity in a world stripped of transcendent meaning. And Charlie's transformation can be read as a case study in bad faith, a flight from the unbearable freedom of grief into the comforting determinism of mission. The character's intellectualism, his tendency to reduce human experience to analyzable patterns, represents an epistemological stance that the film simultaneously celebrates as effective and condemns as dehumanizing. The tension between these two evaluations, Charlie's methods work, but they cost him his humanity, is the philosophical engine that drives the narrative toward its bleak conclusion. The film's treatment of institutions draws on Foucault's analysis of power as diffuse and capillary rather than centralized and repressive, depicting the CIA not as a conspiracy of evil individuals, but as a network of practices, procedures, and assumptions that produce certain outcomes regardless of the intentions of the people who operate within it. This Foucauldian reading suggests that Charlie's rebellion is not against particular bad actors, but against an entire episteme, a way of knowing and organizing the world that renders certain kinds of violence unthinkable and others routine. The absorption of Charlie back into the agency at the film's conclusion is, from this perspective, not a plot twist but an inevitability, because the system is designed to incorporate challenges and transform them into resources. The film's pessimism is thus not merely atmospheric but structural, grounded in a sophisticated understanding of how power operates in the contemporary world. The philosophical content of the film does not announce itself as such, remaining embedded in character choices and narrative events rather than emerging as explicit dialogue about ideas, but attentive viewers will recognize a work of genuine intellectual ambition operating beneath the genre surface. The costume design and visual coding of characters constitute a nonverbal language that communicates information about identity, transformation, and belonging with remarkable efficiency and subtlety. Charlie's wardrobe undergoes a gradual but unmistakable evolution over the course of the narrative, beginning with the soft, unstructured clothing of a man who works in a basement and has no need to impress anyone. His early outfits communicate comfort and invisibility, the sartorial equivalent of a grayed-out option on a user interface, and this visual modesty makes his later transformation all the more striking. As Charlie transitions into his mission, his clothing becomes darker, more structured, and more deliberate, each garment chosen for its functional properties rather than its comfort, and this shift signals his movement from a life defined by internal pursuits to one organized around external objectives. The film uses color strategically, with Charlie progressing through a spectrum from warm neutrals through cool grays to an eventual near black that visually announces his arrival in a moral territory where light no longer penetrates. Sarah's costumes, confined to flashbacks, are characterized by flowing fabrics, floral patterns, and a palette of creams and pastels that associate her with life, growth, and a softness that the narrative will violently extinguish. The contrast between her visual warmth and Charlie's increasing darkness creates a tension that the film never explicitly addresses, but that operates continuously on the audience's subconscious. Inquiline's wardrobe reflects her liminal position between worlds, combining elements of Eastern European elegance with the practical considerations of a woman who has learned to move through dangerous spaces without drawing attention. Her clothing is well-made but not ostentatious, suggesting a history of taste and refinement that has been adapted to the necessities of survival, and this visual narrative provides backstory that the script never verbalizes. Laurence Fishburne's Henderson dresses with the exhausted formality of a career government employee who has long since stopped caring about appearance, but maintains certain standards out of institutional habit. His slightly rumpled suits and loosened ties convey decades of service, the accumulated wear of a man who has been present at too many morally ambiguous operations and has paid for them in sleep he will never recover. The CIA officials, including Moore, dress with the aggressive blandness of bureaucratic power, their clothing expensively nondescript, designed to communicate authority without personality. This visual anonymity is itself a statement about the nature of institutional power, which flows through roles rather than individuals and has no need for the distinguishing marks of charisma. The terrorists are costumed to blend into their environments, their ordinariness a visual argument about the banality of the evil they represent, and the film refuses to give them the visual markers of villainy that would make their deaths feel satisfying. The costume design team has created a visual taxonomy of the film's moral universe, a system of distinctions and transformations that operates in parallel with the scripted narrative and rewards attentive viewing. The film's relationship to the spy thriller genre is simultaneously reverent and deconstructive, honoring the conventions that audiences expect while systematically undermining the assumptions that make those conventions pleasurable. The traditional spy thriller offers the fantasy of individual agency within a world of institutional constraint, the lone operative who cuts through bureaucratic paralysis to achieve results that the system cannot. The film initially appears to embrace this fantasy, positioning Charlie as the amateur who will succeed where the professionals have failed. But the narrative's development steadily complicates this premise until it collapses under the weight of its own implications. The film understands that the fantasy of individual agency is precisely that, a fantasy, and that even the most determined outsider operates within systems that constrain, channel, and ultimately absorb their rebellion. The genre's traditional emphasis on physical competence is inverted, replaced by a competence of a different order that the film argues is more relevant to the actual operations of contemporary power. The spy thriller has historically been a vehicle for fantasies of masculine mastery, and the film engages this tradition by offering a protagonist who fails at every traditional measure of masculinity while succeeding at a form of violence that requires no physical prowess whatsoever. The genre's conventional settings, exotic locations, luxurious hotels, glamorous nightclubs, are present but drained of their usual allure, rendered as spaces of surveillance and vulnerability rather than adventure and romance. The film's treatment of technology similarly subverts genre expectations, refusing the magical devices and impossible hacks that characterize lesser spy narratives in favor of a more grounded depiction of digital tradecraft that is both more credible and more frightening. The traditional spy thriller concludes with the restoration of order, the neutralization of the threat, and the return of the hero to a world made safe by their actions. The film denies its audience every element of this resolution, ending instead with the absorption of the protagonist into the system he opposed, the persistence of the conditions that produce the violence, and a profound uncertainty about whether anything meaningful has been accomplished. This subversion of genre expectations is not merely clever but purposeful, an argument embedded in narrative form about the inadequacy of the stories we tell ourselves about justice, agency, and closure. The film's relationship to its genre is thus best understood as critical homage, a work that respects the spy thriller enough to demand that it grow up, that it confront the moral complexities it has historically evaded, and that it earn the resolutions it has too often offered as empty comfort. The film's engagement with the nature of expertise and the epistemology of intelligence work constitutes one of its most intellectually ambitious dimensions, raising questions about how we know what we know and what it means to act on knowledge that is always partial and contingent. Charlie's skills as a cryptographer represent a particular kind of expertise, one that treats the world as a text to be decoded rather than a reality to be experienced, and this epistemological stance has profound implications for his moral development. The intelligence community depicted in the film operates on the basis of information that is always incomplete, always subject to interpretation, and always vulnerable to the cognitive biases of the analysts who process it. The CIA's decision not to pursue Sarah's killers is presented not as a moral failure per se, but as an epistemological one, a failure to see the human reality behind the data points, to recognize that the abstract category of collateral damage contains within it specific, irreplaceable human lives. Charlie's journey is, in part, an attempt to force the system to see what it has rendered invisible, to make Sarah's death real in a way that the institutional processing of information has prevented. His methods, which rely on the same tools of surveillance and analysis that the agency employs, represent an attempt to turn the epistemology of intelligence work against itself, to use the system's own ways of knowing to reveal the truths it has chosen to ignore. The film is particularly insightful about the way that expertise can become a form of blindness, how the acquisition of specialized knowledge can narrow one's field of vision until certain kinds of reality become literally unthinkable within the framework one has internalized. Henderson's expertise, hard-won through decades of field operations, initially prevents him from recognizing Charlie's capabilities, because those capabilities do not correspond to any category his experience has prepared him to recognize. The confrontation between these two forms of expertise, the practical wisdom of the field agent and the analytical brilliance of the cryptographer, structures the film's middle act and generates its richest character dynamics. The film suggests that genuine intelligence, in both the professional and the cognitive sense, requires the integration of multiple ways of knowing, and that the failure to achieve this integration is responsible for both the CIA's moral failures and Charlie's personal tragedy. The epistemological modesty that the film recommends, the recognition that no single perspective can capture the full complexity of reality, is precisely what its characters lack, and their shared inability to see beyond their own cognitive frameworks drives the narrative toward its devastating conclusion. The thematic exploration of technology as prosthesis, as an extension of human capability that simultaneously augments and diminishes the humans who employ it, runs through the film with the persistence of a baseline, felt even when it is not the focus of attention. Charlie's relationship with his keyboard and screen is depicted with an intimacy that borders on the erotic, a fusion of human consciousness and machine interface that has become so complete that the boundary between them is no longer clearly discernible. The film presents this fusion as both empowering and dehumanizing, granting Charlie capabilities that far exceed his physical limitations while gradually stripping away the emotional and moral responses that would constrain the use of those capabilities. The surveillance infrastructure that Charlie exploits functions as a distributed prosthetic sensorium, extending his perception across continents and through walls, allowing him to see and hear in spaces where his physical body has never been and will never go. This technological extension of the senses creates a paradoxical condition in which Charlie is simultaneously more present and more absent than an unaugmented human could ever be, his consciousness dispersed across networks while his body occupies a single location. The film's depiction of this condition draws on a long tradition of cultural anxiety about the relationship between humans and their tools, from the Prometheus myth through Frankenstein to contemporary debates about artificial intelligence and human enhancement. Charlie's gradual transformation from a man who uses technology to a man who has become technological, who processes the world algorithmically, who reduces moral questions to optimization problems, who treats human beings as variables in equations, is the film's most disturbing argument. The technology that enables his revenge also consumes his humanity, and the film refuses to present this trade-off as anything other than tragic. The keyboard that Charlie wields is, in the film's symbolic vocabulary, a weapon as deadly as any gun, and the film insists that the moral weight of killing is not diminished by the distance and abstraction that digital interfaces provide. This insistence distinguishes the film from the many contemporary narratives that present hacking as a bloodless form of conflict, a cleaner alternative to the messiness of physical violence. The film understands that death is death, regardless of the mechanism that produces it, and that the illusion of distance created by technological mediation is a moral danger in its own right, a seduction that makes killing easier by making it feel less real. The final image of Charlie at his terminal, absorbed back into the system, surrounded by screens that display information he will use to facilitate further operations, is a haunting portrait of the technologically augmented human as something less than fully alive. The cinematographic treatment of space and architecture throughout the film constructs a visual argument about the relationship between individuals and the institutional structures that contain them, an argument made through framing, composition, and camera movement rather than dialogue. The CIA headquarters sequences establish a visual vocabulary of confinement, with Charlie framed against grids, corridors, and repetitive architectural elements that reduce him to a figure within a pattern, a component of a system that precedes and will outlast him. The camera often positions itself at a distance that emphasizes the scale disparity between human bodies and institutional spaces, and this distancing effect communicates the power relations that structure Charlie's world without requiring exposition. The European locations introduce a contrasting visual language of openness and possibility, but the film gradually reveals that this openness is an illusion, that the surveillance infrastructure extends everywhere, and that the freedom Charlie experiences in these spaces is a function of his temporary invisibility rather than any genuine liberation. The architectural spaces that Charlie moves through become progressively more labyrinthine as the narrative develops, reflecting his deepening entanglement in the systems he is attempting to manipulate. The film's use of reflections, in windows, in screens, in polished institutional surfaces, creates a visual motif of doubling and fragmentation that externalizes Charlie's divided consciousness, the simultaneous existence within him of the grieving husband and the calculating operative. The camera's movement shifts from the steady, composed tracking shots of the early sequences to a more agitated, handheld style during the European pursuit, and this shift in visual grammar communicates Charlie's transition from the ordered world of analysis to the chaotic world of action. The framing of violence in the film is distinctive, often holding on wide shots that allow the viewer to see the full spatial context of an act of killing, and this compositional choice resists the tendency of action cinema to isolate violence from its consequences. The spaces between buildings, the interstitial zones that urban architecture creates but that traditional cinematography often ignores, become sites of narrative significance, the places where Charlie operates because they are the places where surveillance is weakest. The film's visual intelligence extends to its treatment of screens within the frame, the diegetic displays that show what Charlie is seeing on his devices, and these compositions create a layered visual experience in which the audience watches Charlie watch his targets, a recursion of observation that mirrors the film's thematic concern with surveillance. The cinematography, credited to a director of photography with a background in both narrative and documentary work, achieves a balance between beauty and functionality that serves the film's dual commitment to aesthetic pleasure and intellectual seriousness. The narrative's treatment of time, both as a structural element of the storytelling and as a thematic concern, rewards careful attention. The film unfolds in a temporality that is simultaneously compressed and elongated, with the urgent pace of Charlie's mission existing in tension with the suspended time of grief, which has no schedule and acknowledges no deadlines. The flashback sequences that depict Charlie and Sarah's life together are not integrated into the narrative as simple chronological interruptions, but as intrusions of a different temporal order, a past that refuses to remain past, that bleeds into the present with the insistence of trauma. The editing rhythm creates a sense of time as fragmented and nonlinear, with cuts that sometimes elide significant durations and sometimes linger on moments that expand to fill more screen time than their narrative function would seem to warrant. This temporal inconsistency is not a flaw but a representation, an attempt to render cinematically the experience of time as it is lived by a consciousness in crisis, for which minutes can feel like hours and hours can disappear without trace. The film's treatment of the deadline structure that organizes most action thrillers is notably casual, with the urgency of Charlie's mission arising from internal compulsion rather than external time pressure. And this choice reflects the film's interest in psychological rather than mechanical sources of tension. The European cities that Charlie visits are presented in temporal as well as spatial terms, each with its own rhythm, its own relationship to history, and this temporal specificity enriches the film's sense of place beyond the merely picturesque. The surveillance technology that Charlie employs operates in a temporality of its own, a near-instantaneous present in which information travels at the speed of light while the bodies it tracks move through the slower time of physical space. This disjuncture between digital and physical temporalities is one of the film's most suggestive observations about contemporary life. The ending of the film, which resolves none of its temporal tensions, leaves the audience in a state of suspension that mirrors Charlie's own condition, a present tense that stretches toward an indefinite future with no promise of resolution. The film's temporal architecture is thus one of its most sophisticated achievements, a dimension of the storytelling that operates beneath the surface of plot to shape the audience's experience of duration, urgency, and the weight of time. The film's engagement with the ethics of representation, particularly the depiction of violence against women as a narrative catalyst, requires analysis that acknowledges the legitimate criticisms of this trope while recognizing the film's attempts to complicate its own complicity. The death of Sarah Heller, presented in the film's opening act, undoubtedly conforms to the pattern that feminist critics have identified as fridging, in which a female character is killed or brutalized to provide motivation for a male protagonist's journey. The film does not escape this critique, and audiences who find the trope irredeemably toxic will find no argument here that would change their minds. What the film does attempt, however, is to treat Sarah's death not as a plot point to be overcome, but as a wound that never heals, an absence that structures every subsequent frame rather than being avenged and forgotten. The flashbacks that return Sarah to the screen are not rewards for Charlie's violence, but accusations, reminders of what has been lost that make his mission feel increasingly hollow rather than increasingly justified. The presence of Inquiline as a female character with her own history of loss, her own perspective on violence, and her own moral authority complicates the gender dynamics in ways that a film with only Sarah's ghost would not achieve. Inquiline functions as a witness whose gaze judges Charlie's actions, and her refusal to validate his mission is the film's most explicit internal critique of the revenge narrative it is simultaneously enacting. The film's treatment of the female body as a site of violence is not gratuitous in its depiction. Sarah's death occurs off-screen, and the film refuses the pornographic lingering on female suffering that characterizes lesser entries in the genre. But the structural dependence of the narrative on female victimization remains a legitimate point of criticism. The film's gender politics are thus mixed, neither fully regressive nor fully progressive, and this ambiguity may reflect the genuine difficulty of telling stories about violence without reproducing the dynamics that make violence possible. The film at least demonstrates awareness of the problem, and this awareness, while not sufficient to resolve the ethical tensions, distinguishes it from works that deploy the fridging trope without any apparent recognition of its history or its implications. The world-building accomplished through background details, environmental storytelling, and the careful construction of institutional cultures creates a fictional universe that feels inhabited and coherent beyond the boundaries of the plot. The CIA offices are filled with the detritus of bureaucratic life: coffee mugs with agency logos, outdated computer equipment, motivational posters that no one reads anymore. And these details accumulate into a portrait of an institution that is simultaneously powerful and shabby, world historical in its reach and disappointingly ordinary in its daily operations. The European settings are populated with extras whose behavior has been directed to convey the texture of specific urban cultures. And this attention to background life creates an immersive quality that supports the narrative's claims to realism. The film's depiction of hacker communities, safe houses, and the infrastructure of covert operations draws on research that lends credibility to the more dramatic elements of the plot. The language environments of the film are particularly well constructed, with multilingual dialogue that reflects the actual linguistic complexity of contemporary Europe, and characters who code switch in ways that reveal their biographies and allegiances. The film's sound design contributes to world building through the careful differentiation of acoustic environments, so that each location has a distinctive sonic signature that the audience learns to recognize. The institutional culture of the CIA is conveyed through the rhythms of its meetings, the hierarchies that determine who speaks when and to whom, and the jargon that simultaneously facilitates communication and excludes outsiders. This attention to the granular details of institutional life grounds the film's more melodramatic elements in a texture of plausibility. The terrorist network that Charlie pursues is similarly built out through environmental clues, the traces they leave in the spaces they inhabit, and this indirect characterization respects the audience's intelligence by allowing inference rather than insisting on exposition. The world of the film extends beyond the edges of the frame, and this sense of extension, of a reality that continues when the camera looks away, is one of the markers of skilled cinematic world-building. The directorial choices made by James Hawes reflect a sensibility shaped by his work in television, particularly the long-form storytelling of series like Slow Horses and the conceptual ambition of Black Mirror. and the film benefits from the distinctive skills that this background has cultivated. Hawes demonstrates a television director's comfort with the pace of procedural storytelling, allowing scenes to develop at lengths that serve character and atmosphere rather than rushing toward the next plot point, and this patience is one of the film's most distinctive qualities. The director also brings a television professional's respect for the intelligence of the audience, trusting viewers to follow complex information without excessive hand-holding, and this trust pays dividends in the film's more intellectually demanding sequences. The influence of Black Mirror is evident in the film's treatment of technology not as a neutral tool, but as a force that reshapes human relationships and moral possibilities, and Hawes approaches the hacking sequences with a seriousness that the material requires. The director's work with actors reflects the collaborative, iterative approach that television production encourages, with performances that feel discovered rather than imposed, and this quality is particularly evident in the scenes between Malek and Fishburne, which have the spontaneity of genuine human interaction. Hawes's blocking of scenes within institutional spaces emphasizes the power dynamics that structure the intelligence community, with characters positioned in relation to each other in ways that communicate hierarchy and alliance without dialogue. The director's handling of action sequences prioritizes clarity and consequence over spectacle, and this restraint prevents the film from becoming the kind of action movie that would contradict its thematic commitments. The European locations are shot with an outsider's appreciation for their specific beauty, but this appreciation never tips into the postcard aesthetic that would undermine the film's paranoid atmosphere. Hawes has delivered a film that reflects the strengths of his television background: patience, attention to character, respect for audience intelligence, while adapting those strengths to the different demands of feature storytelling. The film's conclusion, in which Charlie is absorbed back into the agency, has generated significant interpretative debate, and a fuller analysis of this ending reveals layers of meaning that may not be apparent on first viewing. The absorption represents not a victory for Charlie but a victory for the system, which has demonstrated its capacity to neutralize threats by incorporating them, to transform challenges into resources, and to perpetuate itself by metabolizing the very resistance that should destroy it. Charlie's acceptance of this outcome is not a choice but a recognition of the reality he has come to understand: that there is no outside to the system, no position from which genuine independence can be maintained. The leverage he holds at the end of the film is real, but it is leverage that can only be exercised once, and its exercise would destroy him as thoroughly as it would destroy his targets. The standoff that concludes the narrative is thus a stalemate that favors the status quo, and Charlie's intelligence is sufficient to recognize this. The tragedy of the ending is not that Charlie loses, but that he wins in a way that makes winning indistinguishable from losing, that his victory consists of becoming the thing he set out to punish, and that his continued existence is contingent on his willingness to serve the institution he despises. The film's final image of Charlie at his terminal, surrounded by the tools of his trade, is a mirror image of its opening, and the circular structure suggests that the narrative has been not a journey but a loop, a return to the beginning, with the crucial difference that the man who sits at the desk is no longer the man who left it. The system remains unchanged. The only thing that has changed is Charlie, and the change is not one that anyone would wish for. This is the film's final and most devastating argument: that the pursuit of justice within an unjust system can only corrupt the pursuer, that the tools of the master will never dismantle the master's house, and that the most likely outcome of resistance is not liberation but assimilation. The ending refuses the catharsis that the revenge genre promises, and this refusal is the film's most radical and valuable gesture. The audience is left not with satisfaction but with unease, and this unease is the appropriate response to a story that has demonstrated, with rigorous logic, the impossibility of clean hands in a dirty world. The film's treatment of moral luck, a philosophical concept concerned with how factors beyond an individual's control shape ethical judgments of their actions, operates as an invisible architecture supporting the entire narrative edifice. Charlie Heller is catapulted into his violent trajectory not by any inherent predisposition toward cruelty, but by the contingent fact of his wife's presence in a specific London location at a specific catastrophic moment. The narrative insists that any of us, subjected to identical circumstances, might discover capacities for brutality we would prefer to believe ourselves incapable of possessing. This uncomfortable universality distinguishes the film from more comfortable revenge narratives that permit audiences to maintain distance from their protagonists' moral deterioration. The terrorists themselves are products of their own chains of contingent circumstances, shaped by forces they did not choose and cannot fully articulate, and the film refuses the easy comfort of imagining them as ontologically evil. Henderson's long career has been structured by moral luck as well, the random assignment of missions determining which of his actions history judges as heroic and which as monstrous. The film quietly proposes that our judgments of character are largely judgments of circumstance, that the line between the decent analyst and the remorseless killer is thinner than we want to acknowledge. Sarah's death, the event that triggers everything, is itself a product of the most arbitrary moral luck, a wrong place, wrong time tragedy that has no meaning, no purpose, no narrative coherence. Charlie's attempt to impose meaning on this meaningless event through revenge is the film's central psychological drama, and its failure is foreordained by the fundamental nature of contingent suffering. The surveillance systems that Charlie exploits are designed to eliminate the role of luck in intelligence operations, to replace uncertainty with predictability, and the film suggests that this project is both impossible and dehumanizing. The amateur's success, where professionals fail, is attributed by the film not to superior skill, but to a different relationship with contingency, a willingness to improvise that institutional training systematically suppresses. The film's conclusion, with Charlie absorbed back into the system, represents the final victory of moral luck over intention, the reassertion of forces beyond individual control over the fantasy of autonomous agency. The philosophical sophistication of this treatment elevates the film above genre convention, inviting audiences to recognize their own vulnerability to the same contingent forces that destroy Charlie's world. The production design establishes spatial hierarchies that communicate institutional power dynamics before any character speaks a single word of dialogue, creating environments that function as active participants in the narrative rather than passive backdrops. The CIA headquarters is rendered as a labyrinth of identical corridors, suspended ceilings, and fluorescent lighting that flattens individuality and absorbs personality into institutional anonymity. Charlie's basement workspace is positioned literally beneath the agency's center of power, a spatial representation of his marginal status within the organization's hierarchy. The contrast between this underground domain and the glass-walled offices of senior leadership visualizes the stratification that determines whose voices are heard and whose are ignored. The European safe houses that Charlie utilizes are characterized by their transience, furnished with the minimum necessary for survival, spaces that no one inhabits long enough to make their own. The terrorist targets occupy environments that range from sterile modern apartments to decaying industrial spaces, and this variety resists the homogenization that would make them interchangeable villains. The production design team has created a visual taxonomy of power, mapping institutional authority onto architectural space with precision and consistency. The film's color palette is integrated with its production design, the cool blues and grays of institutional spaces giving way to warmer tones in the few domestic interiors we glimpse. Sarah and Charlie's home, seen primarily in flashbacks, is designed to communicate a life before rupture, filled with books, personal artifacts, and the comfortable disorder of shared habitation. The contrast between this lost domestic space and the anonymous environments Charlie subsequently inhabits is one of the film's most effective visual arguments. The production design participates in the film's thematic work, making visible the structures that constrain, channel, and ultimately absorb individual agency. Every environment in the film has been conceived not merely as a location, but as an argument about the relationship between individuals and the systems that contain them. The narrative's structural use of withholding and revelation demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of how information asymmetry generates suspense, and how delayed disclosure shapes audience engagement with character. The film does not explain Charlie's full capabilities in its opening act, allowing the audience to discover his resources gradually, sharing the surprise of other characters who have consistently underestimated him. The secret that Charlie uncovers about Deputy Director Moore is withheld from the audience until Charlie deploys it, a narrative choice that aligns our perspective with the other characters who are blindsided by his leverage. The motivations of Inquiline are revealed in layers, each new piece of information forcing a recalibration of our understanding of her relationship with Charlie. Henderson's true mission, to ensure Charlie dies in the field, is communicated to the audience through implication rather than statement, and this indirectness respects our capacity for inference. The film understands that the most powerful revelations are those the audience partially anticipates, but cannot fully confirm until the moment of disclosure arrives. The terrorists' connections to each other and to their sponsors are revealed according to a logic that mirrors Charlie's own investigative process, making the audience participants in the decryption rather than passive recipients of exposition. The structural deployment of information in the film is one of its most accomplished technical achievements. The withholding of Sarah's full characterization until late in the narrative, a choice criticized by some viewers, can be defended as a representation of how the dead are gradually revealed to us after they are gone, their fullness emerging through memory rather than presence. The film's ending withholds the satisfaction of closure, and this final withholding is the narrative's ultimate statement about the nature of the story it has told. The architecture of revelation in the film rewards attentive viewing, with details introduced early that acquire significance only in retrospect. The film's engagement with the concept of the banality of evil, drawn from Hannah Arendt's analysis of Adolf Eichmann, but applied to the contemporary intelligence community, provides intellectual depth that distinguishes it from less ambitious genre entries. Deputy Director Moore is not a monster but a manager, a man whose primary concern is the smooth functioning of his department and the advancement of his career. His decision to protect the terrorists responsible for Sarah's death is presented not as an act of ideological commitment, but as bureaucratic calculation, the kind of decision that is made every day in institutions that have lost touch with the human consequences of their operations. The terrorists themselves are depicted as men with ordinary faces and ordinary lives, and this ordinariness is precisely what makes them terrifying. The film argues that the capacity for atrocity is not concentrated in exceptional individuals, but distributed throughout systems that fragment responsibility and distance actors from the results of their actions. Charlie's own transformation follows this logic, his violence emerging not from inherent cruelty, but from the step-by-step rationalization that grief enables. Each killing makes the next one easier, not because Charlie becomes more brutal, but because he becomes more accustomed, more professional, more capable of compartmentalizing the moral weight of his actions. The banality of Charlie's evil is the film's most uncomfortable argument, refusing the consolations of demonization. Henderson embodies this theme most fully, a man who has spent decades doing terrible things for reasons that seemed sufficient at the time, and who has been hollowed out by the accumulation. The film's refusal to provide villains in the traditional sense is a deliberate philosophical choice rather than a narrative failing. The system itself is the antagonist, and the system has no face, no ideology, no evil intent, only procedures, incentives, and institutional inertia. This depersonalization of evil is more disturbing than any cartoon villainy could be, because it implicates the audience in the same structural complicity that ensnares the characters. The film's representation of international space, as simultaneously connected and fragmented, reflects contemporary geopolitical realities with an accuracy rare in mainstream cinema. The European Union's Schengen area, with its elimination of internal border controls, appears in the film as an infrastructure that facilitates Charlie's pursuit while also enabling the movement of his targets. The jurisdictional complexities that arise when an American intelligence operative conducts unauthorized operations on European soil are acknowledged without becoming an obstacle to narrative momentum. The film depicts a world in which national sovereignty is increasingly porous, vulnerable to penetration by both state and non-state actors with sufficient technological resources. The extradition treaties and intelligence sharing agreements that theoretically govern international cooperation are shown to be largely irrelevant when confronted with determined individuals operating in the gaps between legal frameworks. The film's Istanbul sequences engage with Turkey's liminal position between Europe and the Middle East, a geopolitical reality that the narrative exploits without orientalizing. The Russian dimension of the story, embodied in Inquiline, gestures toward the persistence of great power competition even as the primary threats have diffused beyond the state-centric model. The film understands that contemporary international relations are characterized by a proliferation of actors, a fragmentation of authority, and a corresponding impossibility of attributing violence to any single source. The terrorist network that Charlie pursues operates across borders with an ease that the state actors pursuing them cannot match, constrained as they are by the very legal and diplomatic frameworks that terrorism ignores. The film's geopolitical vision is sophisticated without being didactic, embedded in narrative choices rather than announced through exposition. The international cast reinforces this vision, with actors from multiple national traditions embodying characters whose allegiances are complex and sometimes contradictory. The psychological portrait of dissociation that the film constructs through its formal choices represents one of its most ambitious and least discussed achievements. Charlie's experience after Sarah's death is depicted not as intense emotion, but as its opposite, a flattening of effect that the cinematography, sound design, and performance all work together to convey. The color grading shifts toward a desaturated palette that makes the world look drained, as if the vibrancy has been leached from reality itself. The soundscape isolates Charlie from his environment, reducing ambient noise to a distant hum that suggests he is hearing the world through a barrier he cannot remove. Malek's performance in the film's middle section is a study in dissociation, his eyes focused on points the audience cannot see, his responses to stimuli slightly delayed, his effect so flat that he seems to be operating his own body by remote control. This psychological state is both a defense mechanism and a precondition for the violence he commits, protecting him from the full emotional impact of his actions while simultaneously enabling those actions by suppressing the moral responses that would otherwise inhibit them. The film understands that dissociation is not an absence of feeling, but a sequestration of feeling, a compartmentalization that allows functioning at the cost of integration. The flashbacks to Sarah are not merely narrative exposition, but representations of the intrusive memories that characterize traumatic grief, the past breaking into the present with a vividness that contrasts painfully with the dulled quality of current experience. The film's treatment of dissociation builds toward Charlie's eventual reintegration, which arrives not as healing but as a different kind of damage, the return of feeling bringing not relief, but an overwhelming recognition of what he has done. This psychological trajectory gives the film's conclusion its devastating force, as the dissociative barrier crumbles and Charlie is forced to inhabit the full weight of his transformed self. The screenplay's use of dialogue as a tool of characterization rather than exposition demonstrates craftsmanship that rewards close attention, with each major character distinguished by verbal tics, rhetorical strategies, and patterns of speech that reveal personality and history. Charlie speaks in the compressed, precise language of a man who values efficiency over elaboration, his sentences stripped of ornament, his responses often delayed by the beat of analysis that precedes articulation. This verbal style is entirely consistent with his profession and personality, and it contrasts effectively with the other characters' more expansive modes of expression. Henderson speaks in the world-weary cadences of a man who has explained himself too many times to audiences who did not understand, his language colored by a gallows humor that serves as both defense mechanism and genuine wisdom. Moore's dialogue is characterized by the bland euphemisms of bureaucratic power, the language of a man who has learned to describe morally catastrophic decisions in the neutral vocabulary of resource allocation and risk assessment. Inquiline's speech patterns reflect her multilingual background, her English inflected with Russian cadences and her word choices occasionally surprising, revealing a mind that thinks across linguistic boundaries. The terrorists are given dialogue that resists demonization, their speech reflecting the ordinary motivations and rationalizations of men who have persuaded themselves that their violence is justified. The screenplay trusts the audience to interpret character through speech without the assistance of explanatory dialogue that would break the illusion of autonomous existence. The silences in the film are as carefully scripted as the speech, with characters withholding words in ways that communicate more than any line could convey. The dialogue achieves the difficult balance of sounding natural while carrying the thematic weight the narrative requires. The film's understanding of grief as a fundamentally disorienting experience that does not follow the neat stages popularized by reductive psychology informs every aspect of its narrative construction. Charlie does not move from denial to anger to bargaining to depression to acceptance in any recognizable sequence. Instead, he experiences all of these states simultaneously, unpredictably, and in ways that resist narrative tidiness. The film's structural irregularity, its refusal to conform to the predictable rhythms of the revenge thriller, can be understood as a formal representation of grief's temporal disruption. The flashbacks that interrupt the narrative are not placed at the moments of maximum emotional manipulation, but arrive unpredictably, mirroring the intrusive quality of traumatic memory. The The film acknowledges that grief is not something one goes through and emerges from, but something one learns to carry, a permanent addition to the self rather than a temporary condition. Charlie's turn to violence is presented not as a healthy processing of grief, but as a catastrophic failure of processing, an attempt to solve an emotional problem with the wrong tools. The film's conclusion suggests that grief has not been resolved but merely transformed, the raw wound of loss replaced by the scar tissue of guilt and complicity. This representation of grief is more honest than the therapeutic narratives that dominate mainstream cinema, and its honesty contributes to the discomfort that the film produces in audiences conditioned to expect emotional resolution. The film argues that some losses cannot be metabolized, that some wounds do not heal, and that the attempt to force closure through violent action produces only additional wounds. The grief narrative that the film constructs is not satisfying in the conventional sense, and this lack of satisfaction is precisely the point. The film's commentary on the privatization of intelligence and the growth of the contractor class within the national security state reflects developments that have transformed the landscape of espionage since the end of the Cold War. The boundaries between public and private, government and corporation, have become increasingly difficult to discern in the world the film depicts. The technologies that Charlie uses to track his targets are developed by private companies, sold to governments, and accessible to anyone with sufficient resources and expertise. The surveillance infrastructure that the film critiques is not exclusively governmental, but represents a public-private hybrid that complicates traditional notions of accountability. The CIA's reliance on contractors for functions once performed by employees reflects the real-world evolution of the intelligence community toward a model that prioritizes flexibility and deniability over institutional continuity. The film gestures toward the moral hazards of this arrangement, in which responsibility can be endlessly deferred along contractual chains that lead nowhere. Charlie's status as an amateur, operating outside official channels, ironically mirrors the position of the contractors who increasingly perform the work of the state without being subject to its constraints. The film's critique of this system is implicit but sharp, suggesting that the privatization of violence has not made violence more accountable but less. The terrorists themselves may be understood as private actors in a globalized market for violence, their services available to the highest bidder, their motivations a complex mixture of ideology and economics. The film maps a world in which the state's monopoly on legitimate violence has eroded, replaced by a marketplace in which violence is a commodity like any other. This mapping is one of the film's most significant contributions to the spy thriller genre, updating its concerns for an era in which the old certainties about who holds power and how it is exercised have dissolved. The film's treatment of mentorship as a corrupted institution, embodied in the relationship between Henderson and Charlie, subverts the conventions of the training narrative that structures so many entries in the action genre. Henderson is assigned to train Charlie, but his actual mission is to ensure Charlie's death, and this fundamental betrayal poisons the mentor-student relationship from its inception. The wisdom that Henderson offers, about the cost of violence, about the impossibility of clean hands, about the loneliness of the operative's life, is genuine, but it is offered in bad faith, as a sedative rather than an education. Charlie recognizes this bad faith and extracts what is useful from Henderson's teaching while maintaining a distance that prevents genuine trust from developing. The scenes between these two characters are charged with a tension that arises from the gap between their official relationship and its hidden purpose. Fishburne's performance captures the complexity of a man who has been ordered to facilitate a murder and has chosen to obey, and his Henderson is simultaneously sympathetic and contemptible. The film understands that mentorship within institutions is often a mechanism of co-optation, a way of transmitting institutional values and suppressing the independence that might threaten institutional survival. Charlie's refusal to be mentored, his insistence on learning what he needs while rejecting the institutional identity that Henderson represents, is a form of resistance that the film quietly celebrates. The mentorship plot resolves not with a passing of the torch, but with a mutual recognition of a reconcilable difference, Henderson returning to the institution he serves and Charlie moving beyond its reach, temporarily at least. This resolution is more honest than the sentimentalized mentor relationships that dominate mainstream cinema, acknowledging that genuine mentorship is impossible between people who serve different masters. The film's treatment of this theme contributes to its overall pessimism about the possibility of authentic human connection within systems designed to instrumentalize every relationship. The film's visual effects and their integration into the narrative deserve analysis for their restraint and their commitment to serving story rather than spectacle. The hacking sequences are visualized through interfaces that prioritize legibility and plausibility over the flashy, nonsensical graphics that plague lesser films about digital warfare. Charlie's screens display recognizable operating systems, command line interfaces, and software tools that correspond to real-world applications. And this commitment to authenticity grounds the film's more dramatic moments in technical credibility. The surveillance footage that Charlie accesses is degraded in ways that reflect actual CCTV quality, with compression artifacts, motion blur, and limited resolution that make his feats of identification more impressive by making them more difficult. The film avoids the temptation to visualize cyberspace as a three-dimensional environment, recognizing that the reality of hacking, text on screens, patience, incremental progress, is inherently uncinematic and trusting the audience to find drama in the implications rather than the imagery. The visual effects budget has been allocated to invisible effects. The seamless removal of modern elements from period locations, the subtle enhancement of practical stunts, the digital extension of physical sets. This allocation reflects a philosophy of effects as enhancement rather than attraction, a philosophy increasingly rare in contemporary blockbuster cinema. The film's restraint in this area is consistent with its overall aesthetic of groundedness, its resistance to the temptations of spectacle that would undermine its thematic seriousness. The visual effects team has done work that will go largely unnoticed, and this invisibility is the measure of their success. The film demonstrates that effects can be spectacular without being spectacularized, that the most impressive technical achievements are often those the audience never consciously registers. The film's exploration of identity as performance, of the self as a construction that can be modified, discarded, and replaced, connects its spy thriller mechanics to deeper questions about authenticity in the contemporary world. Charlie begins the film with a stable identity: husband, analyst, introvert, moral innocent. Each of these components is stripped away by the narrative's events until the man who remains at the film's conclusion bears only a superficial resemblance to the man who existed at its beginning. The film asks whether this new man is the real Charlie, revealed by circumstances that stripped away pretense or a fabrication, a mask that has fused to the face beneath it until no distinction remains. The identities that spies assume in the field, the legends they construct and inhabit, are extreme versions of the identity work that all people perform in their daily lives, and the film understands this continuity between the exceptional and the ordinary. Charlie's transformation from analyst to operative is a process of identity construction, and the film traces this process with attention to the moments of choice that accumulate into a new self. The question of whether Charlie can ever return to his former identity, whether the man who killed can ever again be the man who had never killed, hangs over the film's conclusion with a weight that no answer could relieve. The film suggests that identity is not an essence but a narrative, a story we tell ourselves about who we are, and that this narrative can be rewritten by events we do not choose. The tragedy of Charlie's transformation is not that he becomes someone else, but that he loses the ability to tell a story about himself that he can bear to hear. This treatment of identity resonates beyond the specifics of the spy thriller genre, addressing anxieties about authenticity and selfhood that characterize the contemporary moment. The film's integration of practical and digital filmmaking techniques achieves a hybrid aesthetic that combines the texture of location shooting with the precision of digital post-production. The European cities are captured with an immediacy that only practical photography can provide, the light and atmosphere of real places infusing the frame with an authenticity that soundstages cannot replicate. The action sequences employ practical effects wherever possible, with digital augmentation used to enhance, rather than replace the physical reality of stunts and physical performances. The film's color grading builds on the foundation of practical cinematography, enhancing and unifying rather than imposing an artificial palette. This hybrid approach reflects a philosophy of filmmaking that values the contributions of both traditional and digital techniques, refusing the dogmatic positions that characterize debates about cinematic realism. The film looks expensive without looking artificial, polished without looking plastic, and this balance is the achievement of craftspeople working at the highest level of their professions. The integration of practical and digital elements is seamless, the seams invisible by design, and this invisibility is a technical achievement of the first order. The film demonstrates that the supposed conflict between practical and digital filmmaking is a false dichotomy, that the most effective approach combines the strengths of both traditions. The visual texture of the film is consistent across its varied locations and lighting conditions, a coherence that testifies to the strength of the directorial vision and the skill of the technical team. The film is a showcase for a mode of filmmaking that has become increasingly rare in an industry polarized between micro-budget indies and effects-driven blockbusters. The film's sound mixing and its management of the relationship between dialogue, effects, and music demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of how audio shapes emotional response. The dialogue is mixed with clarity that ensures every word is intelligible, but this clarity does not come at the expense of the ambient sound that grounds scenes in specific environments. The balance between these elements shifts according to the narrative's emotional requirements, with dialogue pushed forward in intimate scenes and pulled back in sequences where environment and action take precedence. The score is integrated with the sound design rather than laid on top of it, the electronic textures of the music blending with the hum of servers and the click of keyboards until the boundary between score and sound design becomes productively ambiguous. The film's action sequences are mixed to emphasize impact without becoming punishing, the dynamic range preserved so that loud moments have the space to be genuinely startling. The quiet passages are mixed with equal care, the near silence of certain sequences creating a vacuum that draws the audience deeper into Charlie's isolated subjectivity. The sound mixing team has created an auditory experience that rewards attentive listening on quality equipment while remaining effective on the compromised audio systems through which most viewers will encounter the film. The mix translates effectively across formats, from theatrical exhibition to home viewing to headphone listening, a versatility that reflects careful planning and technical expertise. The film's audio is as carefully composed as its visuals, and the two elements work together in a partnership that enhances both. The marketing and distribution context of the film's release shaped its reception in ways that illuminate broader patterns in the contemporary film industry. The decision to market the film as a conventional action thriller, emphasizing the revenge plot and the international locations, while downplaying its meditative qualities and its ambiguous ending, generated audience expectations that the film itself could not satisfy. This mismatch between marketing and content is not unique, but is particularly consequential for a film whose pleasures depend on the gradual subversion of genre expectations. Audiences who arrived expecting the cathartic violence promised by the trailers left disappointed. Audiences who arrived with no expectations discovered a more interesting film than the marketing suggested. The film's positioning within the streaming ecosystem, available for home viewing shortly after or simultaneously with its theatrical release, shaped the conditions under which most viewers encountered it. The domestic viewing environment, with its distractions and its permission to pause and resume, is not ideal for a film that depends on the accumulation of tension and the maintenance of atmosphere. The film was released into a market in which the mid-budget adult thriller, once a staple of studio release schedules, has become an endangered species, and its reception reflects the unfamiliarity of contemporary audiences with the pleasures this mode of filmmaking provides. The film's commercial performance cannot be separated from these contextual factors, and its critical reception must be understood in light of expectations shaped by marketing decisions over which the filmmakers may have had limited control. The film is, in this sense, a case study in the challenges facing adult-oriented genre cinema in the contemporary marketplace.